KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more, Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.
David F. Walker tackles serious material, but sometimes with unexpected influences.
And then I thought of The Muppet Show, of all things, and I thought of Statler and Waldorf, and I thought of how there's nothing funnier than, it doesn't even have to be two old people. It can just be two people telling the same story, but disagreeing on the details.
And that's how he came up with the idea of retelling Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, with Big Jim and Huck as old men, adding a fresh commentary to the familiar tale. It's a clever reimagining of a classic but problematic work of literature. Welcome back to listener-supported KPBS Cinema Junkie. I'm Beth Accomando. David F. Walker has been a frequent guest on Cinema Junkie, often talking about blaxploitation. But I've also had him on to discuss his graphic novels, such as The Black Panther Party. He just published a new graphic novel called Big Jim and the White Boy, which allows Jim to be the protagonist in Twain's story rather than Huck. That means we get to see him as a more fully fleshed out character, and we get to learn more about his family. Walker also weaves in real history and historical characters to provide more context to Twain's novel. Walker discusses his creative process, the rabbit holes he went down in his research, and why he loves sequential storytelling. I need to take one quick break, and then I'll be back with David F. Walker.
KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more, Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.
Welcome back to Cinema Junkie. I'm Beth Accomando. Before we get into the details of David F. Walker's Big Jim and the White Boy, I wanted him to shed some light on how the project originated.
It's actually a twofold process. I'm going to say like maybe 10, 15 years ago, I had the idea of doing a retelling of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And at the time, it was going to be prose. It wasn't going to be a graphic novel. And I dinked around with it, and I have a very dear friend. She calls it slow writing. And slow writing sometimes is very close to being no writing. And so I would always go back to this Huck Finn book. My cousin would yell at me periodically. He's like, man, this is going to be a great thing. You got to do it. I'm like, yeah, whatever. And then over 10 Speed Press, I did the nonfiction graphic novel on the Black Panther Party. And I had finished writing it, but it was still being drawn by Marcus Kwame Anderson. And my agent reached out to me and he said, hey, 10 Speed, they're trying to figure out, what are some projects we could do next. And he said, they're interested in doing retellings of certain works of classic literature, and they're interested in maybe doing Adventures of Huckleberry Finn if you'd be interested in writing it. And I was like, well, as a matter of fact. And so, years later, this idea that I had started, something came along that sort of ignited a new interest in it and made me realize sometimes you'll have an idea, but if someone's not paying you to do it, you're not going to do it. You're just going to kind of sit around on it. And I fell into that trap with what became Big Jim and the White Boy. Like, I don't think I would have done it had my agent not said anything, had 10 Speed not been interested in doing something along these lines. And then ultimately, it's sort of the way the fates of the universe work. It all worked out. And then Marcus was able to draw it. And at the time he was drawing Black Panther Party. And that was such a positive experience that even during that process, I was like, yeah, I don't know if I could ever do another long project again if Marcus isn't part of it,
Do you remember the first time you read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and how you reacted to it?
I don't remember the first time I read it. I remember the first time I saw a film version of it, which was in the 70s.
Jim?
I gotta go.
Jim, honey,
I gotta go now. I gotta get away from here.
Got to go? What did you do, Jim?
I ain't done nothing, but they're gonna sell me to the slave traders.
Not Miss Watson.
She can't help it. Huck's captain came and took him away. Well, and the ladies, they need the money to buy her back.
Jim, you know what they do to runaway slaves. They catch you, they whip you, they truss you up like a hog.
But if they sell me, then I may as well be dead. Because I won't never see you no more.
And all I remember is that I believe Jeff East, who played young Clark Kent in Superman the movie, was in it.
Starring Jeff East as
Sarah Williams.
George Peters. My real name's George Jackson.
Huckleberry.
Rather.
Paul Winfield as good old Jim.
Find anything?
Nothing. Ain't nothing in there, but a dead man. Ain't nothing but a house of death. Let's get out of here.
But I knew the book, and I'd read the Classics Illustrated version. I feel that every great comic book writer should have read all of the classics, but they should have read the Classics Illustrated version first, right? So, but that didn't really answer your question, did it?
Well, I was just curious, like, how it impacted you. I mean, why was this something that eventually came up as, like, I want to revisit it?
So that's a great question. That I can answer. So I couldn't tell you exactly when I read the book. It had to be probably around 12 or something like that. But as with a lot of things, the way my brain was wired, even as a kid, if there was whether it was a book or a comic or a film, TV show, if there was a black character in it, I would be drawn to that character. And then I would start asking a lot of questions. And usually the questions were like, why? Why is this happening like this? And so with Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, most of the film versions ease back on the vernacular and the way Jim is portrayed. He's always portrayed in a sort of pseudo minstrel-like way. But in the book, Mark Twain's original book, that vernacular that he uses, which at the time seemed very revolutionary and groundbreaking, was also firmly rooted in the tradition of the minstrel show, right? And I just remember reading it and thinking, okay, come on, really? Like, but the two big questions, and I've said this in other interviews that I asked, was one is, why is he going south? Right? If you're a runaway slave, the only thing they taught us about slavery and the Underground Railroad was you run north and you follow the North Star, right? And then the other question that I had was, why is he so loyal to Huck? And at the time, I couldn't quite wrap my head around some of these concepts. But the older I got, and the more I studied the story, the more I read, the more I wrote, the more I began to formulate these sort of ideas of like, okay, well, the question just kept coming back because at the end of the day, when we look at American literature, Jim and Uncle Tom are the two most famous Black characters in American literature from that era, from the 1800s. One is pre-Civil War, one is post-Civil War. And both of those characters, I think, have merit. I also think that most people don't even understand the historical significance of those characters, what they were really all about. Most people don't know about Harriet Beecher Stowe and her background. They don't know about Mark Twain and his background. They also don't know about, Margaret Mitchell and her background and why she wrote Gone with the Wind and the fact that she was a horrifically racist human being who would fit in very well in today's society. We'll just leave it at that.
So to answer some of your questions of why, you've reimagined this Mark Twain book. And so describe a little bit about the approach you take to that source material and how you wanted to kind of reimagine it for your graphic novel.
Yeah, the first thing I did was I sat down and I reread the book. I highlighted all the passages with Jim, and I have multiple copies of the book. I found an annotated version with, footnotes and glossary and all that sort of stuff. So that was helpful. And then from there, I immediately was like, okay, I had a choice. One was, do I retell the book sort of scene by scene with that the scenes that Jim is in? And this is ultimately what Percival Everett did with his book, James. I made the decision really early on to not do that. And the reason why was Mark Twain, there's two things he didn't deal with in the book. One is he didn't really deal with the subject of slavery in a larger context. And then he didn't deal with the Civil War. The novel was written pretty much after the failure of Reconstruction. And I want to be careful not to condemn him for how he wrote it, why he wrote it, whatever. But there's a lot of interesting stuff that was left on the table. And I was like, if I want this book to really stand apart and not just be a cover song, a cover version of a classic song, I'm going to need to recompose it. I'm going to need to take the idea of what Mark Twain started and build from that. And so then that led to like, okay, I need to understand Missouri. I need to understand what slavery was like in Missouri. I need to understand the world that Mark Twain came from. I knew that he worked as a newspaper reporter, so I needed to understand what was in the news both before he became a reporter and then during it. And all of this is really my way of not doing work, right? This is my preferred form of procrastination. So I did a ton of research and just started discovering all these things, and I was like, this would really fit in well with an adventure, an adventure story. And sort of the goal with Jim and the story itself was I want to take the idea of the American folk hero, be that folk hero, someone based in reality, Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone and all those guys, or the fictional folk heroes, the Johnny Appleseeds and the Paul Bunyans. And I wanted to like create the only African American folk hero there is that people remember. It's not the only one, but the only one that people remember is John Henry, the steel driving man, right? And I was like, okay, let's think about how would we turn Jim into a folk hero. And then it was like, but once he's a folk hero, how do we unpack who he is behind the scenes, right? And this is, sort of how the brain of David Walker operates, which is not a fun place to be in sometimes. It can be kind of scary, but we at the end it gets the job done.
Now, the book starts with a number of pages that feel lifted from the original book.
Yeah.
So you have like 3 pages of this, and then you interrupt that. So kind of talk about your decision to do it that way, because it does, like when you start looking at it, the way the images are, the language that's used does strike you as, however you want to put it, dated, problematic, whatever.
Yeah.
So discuss why you wanted to do it that way and what impact you hoped it had.
So I'm a fan of Little Big Man, the book and the film, and the idea of both a semi-unreliable narrator, but also that person that you meet who has all these crazy stories to tell, and you're like, did this is this person telling the truth, or is this like just a load of garbage? As I was thinking about it originally, I was like, okay, in the 30s and 40s, there were a lot of audio recordings of slaves, the former enslaved, which is where a lot of what we should know about slavery comes from, although so much of that information is being held back from us. But I was like, well, what if Jim lived to be a really old man? He's that old man who's always upset. That's like, this is my story, and they stole my story from me. And so it began from there. And in the early drafts of the book, it was this sort of New Deal sort of history recording crew, because I believe that came out of the New Deal, a lot of those slave recordings. So it started out that way, and then I was like, yeah, it sucks and it's boring, right? I was like, how do you make it better? And then I thought of the Muppet Show of all things, and I thought of Statler and Waldorf, and I thought of how there's nothing funnier than it doesn't even have to be two old people. It can just be two people telling the same story, but disagreeing on the details. And I was like, okay, let's have Huck be alive too. Let's have these two really old men. And if the reader doesn't know if they're being honest or not, that's fine. Because that's sort of the story. My grandfather would tell these stories sometimes, and it was like, really? You were best friends with Harry Belafonte? How was that possible? And then he would tell these stories. And what was interesting is like a lot of times there's no pictures to back it up, right? And I come from a family. I don't come from a family. We all come from families that are intricate parts of history, period, right? Just because their names and their actions aren't written down in history books doesn't mean they didn't do significant things. And so I was thinking a lot about that. I was thinking about the stories that if I tell folks, not only, so my grandfather was good friends with Harry Belafonte. My grandfather's cousin was not only good friends with Ossie Davis, he was also good friends with Malcolm X, who he met through Ossie Davis, but he also knew Martin Luther King Jr., right? And if I tell people that, they look at you and they just go, what? No, that can't be possible. And so I wanted to play with some of those notions of how history works, how we share that history, how it's passed along, and then the books are sort of that and a lot of kicking and screaming, and the book came along from there.
So talk a little bit more about the structure, because in addition to your characters kind of interrupting a narrative, you also jump back and forth in time to have characters from the 30s and then the 80s and I think the 2000s all kind of adding layers to your story. And how did you kind of come up with that approach?
A lot of it was trial and error. A lot of it was I love context, right? I pick up a book, and if the book has pictures, I like to read the captions because the captions usually tell you something that's slightly different than what's in the body of the book. And I just was thinking about all the different ways information can be transmitted and how one generation can affect all the generations that come after, even though we don't talk about it. And again, a lot of it was trial and error. Marcus Kwame Anderson, my artist, is an amazing collaborator. I would start to write sequences. I would start to go down, a certain path with the story, and then I'd go, "Yeah, this isn't quite working," right? And I would talk to him, and I would say, "How do you feel about it?" Like he hadn't started drawing it, certain things yet, and I was always looking for how do I make this more compelling? What is it that I always wish I had from a story that I'm not putting into the story? These are the sort of questions I was asking. And then at one point, I hit this moment where I was like, there's no good female characters in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And it's like, how do I work a good female character in? So then I created the college professor, but she was kind of dry and lifeless. And I was like, she doesn't work. I don't, but I need her. How do I make her more compelling, more interesting? Oh, wait a minute. What if she is the descendant of Jim? And suddenly then the story, new layers begin to develop. And the thing I had to do, and I do this a lot with my work now, is to never be afraid to make the changes that need to be made for it to become more compelling. It's not done until it's off to the printer. And until it's off to the printer, you should always be willing to change certain things and move things around. And I wanted this to be the best book it could possibly be. And I wasn't afraid to listen to what the book and the characters were telling me whenever they were like, no, 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 this ain't working. Like you have to sort of turn down the volume on those voices that when they talk to you, the creative voices, they're usually right. They usually steer you in the proper direction.
Now, you've mentioned the artist Marcus Kwame Anderson a couple times. Because this is for radio,
Yeah.
describe his visual style. Describe kind of how he brings these characters to life through his illustration.
He has a style that I think is often used in a sort of negative way. People would say it's cartoony, right? The stuff he does isn't super photorealistic, but he's also a very versatile artist. And anyone who's looked at our Black Panther Party book can see that versatility there. But one of the things he's able to do is convey emotion with a minimal amount of lines. And that's what comics are supposed to be, right? The great Alex Toth always talked about use the least amount of lines possible and then use less than that. And Marcus and I talked a lot about artists like Alex Toth, Will Eisner, folks like that who really define this medium that him and I love so much. Again, there was also that sense of familiarity. And so when the publisher said, who's an artist that you would like? I said, I think Marcus would be good. And they were like, oh, but he's so cartoony. And I was like, yeah, no, he is cartoony. We know that, but he's also more versatile than that. What we want to convey in this story is both emotion and clarity of action. And by clarity of action, I mean it's what I call squares and rectangles, which is comic pages are rectangular, and then the panels that fit into those pages are both squares and rectangles most of the time. The moment you start deviating from that sort of grid, the harder it can be to read. And the one complaint I hear a lot of times from people is like, oh, I don't know how to read comics. I don't know how to read graphic novels. I don't know. I'm not sure what order I'm supposed to read those bubbles with the words in them, right? And Marcus and I are always talking about how do we make it easier for the reader to look at a page, to look at a panel, know what to read first, know where the eye is supposed to move, and in that regard, he's as classically trained an artist as they can be. And you forget that it's cartoonish, right? You forget that it looks almost like animation cells, and that Jim's eyes are just a line and a semicircle, right? You can't even really see the pupils or anything, but it's like that doesn't matter because the way his brow line is, the way his eyebrows are, speak emotion. And that understanding of how to create complexity through something that seems to look simple is not an easy task, but Marcus knows how to do it.
Well, I thought it was really impressive too, that change you get from those panels of Mark Twain's story.
Mhm.
First, you cut to them as older characters, but then to Jim. I mean, those are, like you say, simple lines, but the difference in how you perceive Jim drawn in those two different styles is light and day.
This is a testimony both to Marcus and this is all stuff I think about too. So even the first time we see the quote unquote real Jim, it's when you turn a page. So if you're reading it as a physical book, boom, that you turn that page, there he is, and you're like, wow. And my good friend Brian Bendis was talking to me about that, and he was like, that was intentional, wasn't it? And I was like, of course it was intentional. And you know me well enough to know that it's like, what do we reveal on the page turn? And with a page turn, it always has to be that image that's on the right facing side of a spread, not the left facing side. Because what people usually see first when they turn a page is what's on the right facing side. So you have it on the left facing side. People look at the right and then they look over, and it's this weird dynamic of how people read comics. So they look, you don't want to have that spoiler image facing them on that odd number page. It has to be on that even. And you look, oh, that's Jim, and that's what we wanted. And we talked about it. We talked about everything from like how different sections of the book would be drawn to how they would be colored so that we could take the readers on a journey that in a lot of ways they would understand stuff almost on an instinctive level. And I really, as part of my inspiration, there was two or three Spike Lee films. Most notably would be Malcolm X, but then Do the Right Thing, and everything up to Malcolm X. Really, there was a level of inspiration because Spike Lee's team that he worked with, which included Ernest Dickerson as his director of photography, but that whole team did all these things with color and with shot choices and editing choices, and I was like, this is what it looks like when a filmmaker uses the right team, the best team you can possibly get. It's interesting because I've talked about this regarding other filmmakers. Sometimes there's this drastic shift in the quality of their work. And the first thing I always do is who's their DP and who edited this movie, right? And you can see it. Like if you know how to look for that stuff, you can start to figure it out. And I Marcus and I wanted to treat this not like a film per se, but using some of those principles of like, okay, how do we use color to evoke emotion? How do we use drawing styles to, what can we do so that when the reader turns the page, they know, oh, we're back in the 1930s as opposed to, the 1850s.
You mentioned research earlier, and there's a lot of real history in the book and real historical characters. So, in doing all that research, was there anything you found that surprised you, or was there, like, you talk about going down rabbit holes? I mean, how many of those rabbit holes did you have?
I had so many of them. I think the biggest thing, there was a couple, and there was stuff that didn't end up really making it into the book, but there was a lot of it was just about Missouri and Kansas specifically. And what a lot of people don't know historically is that what would become the American Civil War, when the southern states seceded from the nation, the precursor to that was what was known as the border wars in Missouri and Kansas, going back into the 1850s. And I knew a little bit about that, but I really did like a deep dive into the research of that particular era and what was going on, what slavery was like in the state of Missouri, and then what was going on in some of the surrounding states. So while Illinois was technically a free state, it was a state where a lot of unscrupulous business people would quote unquote rent enslaved individuals to work as slaves in Illinois, right? And there was a thing that now is known as the reverse Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad was what the enslaved used to escape to freedom. The reverse was these people that were running around kidnapping free blacks, kidnapping or capturing those who'd run away, and then selling them back into slavery. And so there was a lot of little things like that I stumbled across. I think the biggest thing, and it's in the book, there was a town in Illinois called New Philadelphia. And when I'd read about that in my research, the existence of New Philadelphia and the man who founded it was a guy named Free Frank McWhorter. He had already died by the time Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was set, right? But I had to have him in the book. I had to have the town in the book. I was like, it was one of those things like, how come more people don't know about him? They don't know about this town. And so there was always these little things that I would stumble across. Mark Twain was a huge fan of a writer named Ned Buntline, and Buntline wrote the equivalent to like pulp novels of the earlier 1800s. And there were all these characters that really inspired Mark Twain. And in fact, in Tom Sawyer is a fan of Ned Buntline's books, right? And so I was introduced to even the pop culture that Mark Twain was consuming. And so everything was sort of, I feel like if you're doing research, whether it's for a fictional book or a nonfiction work, if you're not finding stuff you didn't know, and if you're not surprised and sort of looking around going, how come I didn't know this? How come more people don't know this? Then you're doing something really, really wrong. I was just having a conversation with my good friend John Jennings about this sort of thing, and you know John and his work, I'm assuming, and I can't remember what it was that I dropped on him, but he was like, "What are you talking about?" And I always feel like if I can surprise John with something, like I've done a year's worth of work in 5 minutes. Whatever it had something to do with comics. Oh no, it was this white writer named Octavius Roy Cohen, who wrote a lot of stuff for Saturday Evening Post. And he had this character whose name was like Slappy McWhite or something like that. But it was a black private investigator. And he wrote like something like 100 short stories for Saturday Evening Post with this character who was sort of this bumbling private detective who talked in this vernacular very similar to the minstrels of the day. But up until like 2 weeks ago, I'd never heard of this character. John had never heard of this character. And they actually made a series of short films in the late 20s, early 30s with this character. Again, and I know you know this, Beth, because you're on that same nerd level where you're like, how did I not know this? Right. And I felt so good stumping John Jennings on that one. I was like, oh my God, I got him. I got him. But it also made me go, and I stumbled upon this like really randomly. And then suddenly the wheels start turning, right? This is how the wheels of creativity start to turn. You're like, huh, what could I do with this character? I'm obsessed with Charlie Chan, but I'm more obsessed with his chauffeur, Birmingham Brown. What could I do with these characters? What could I do with, and there's so many of them throughout pop culture that have been forgotten. A lot of them lapsed into public domain. And you just have to be, I think so many people are afraid of the concept of research. And it's like, no, research is like it is the best form of procrastination. It's the best form of bizarre addiction. It's the best obsessive compulsive behavior we can have. You learn all sorts of new fun stuff.
So, the Black Panther graphic novel you did was very much based in fact and history. And with Huck Finn, or Big Jim, you're kind of taking a more fictional approach, but weaving history into it. And both of these were graphic novels. So what is it about the graphic novel or the comic book form that attracts you and that makes you feel like this is the way I want to tell these stories and mix all these elements in?
Oh, you would have to ask me the hard question, right? I loved comics as a kid, right? I was that kid. I'm not exaggerating. I literally learned how to read with comics. I've always loved the juxtaposition of visuals, imagery, and text. And I loved comics more than I loved even Dr. Seuss books, right? Because Dr. Seuss books or any of those children's books, the Bernstein Bears, any of that sort of stuff, you had one image per page. That was it. And there might be some action or dynamic there, but there's something about what Will Eisner called sequential art, sequential storytelling, which just really pulled me in as a kid, and I came of age. I was reading comics by the early 70s, which was a really great time for American comics. And if I had the patience and the wherewithal, I would have become a comic book artist. I think very visually, but I don't have the skill set to pull it off. And so a lot of times when I have an idea, my first thought is, how do you turn this into a comic, right? How do you turn this into a graphic novel? I just happen to think, even if I'm reading a book on the history of film or the history of music or whatever, I like to see pictures. I want to know what this person looked like. And I think that most people, I mean, we've sort of quickly moved out of this phase of people wanting to read and see pictures. Now they just want to listen. They want to watch their video essays or their podcasts or whatever. And that's fine. Um, but for me, um, there's a way to take all these things that I love, visual elements, visual works of art, written word, sequential storytelling, history, mixing history with fiction, all these things that I just love, and just going, okay, here's a medium that allows me to do this in a way that, film can allow me to do it in some ways, but there's so many more hoops. Film is so much more expensive to do. And prose, while I love writing prose, it feels almost like a lost art form to me. Or maybe I should say, reading straight prose feels like it's becoming an increasingly lost art form. Like people want something else. And so now it's about trying to find that balance between all of that.
Mark Twain supposedly based the characters of Jim and Huckleberry Finn on people he knew. You kind of take that and then you kind of take that a few steps further. So how did you want to develop these characters, and how much like other history did you want to weave into this?
That's a great question. Well, yeah, so Huck Finn was primarily based on a kid he grew up with that he knew growing up. And same with Jim. Jim was based on a man named Daniel Quarles, who was owned by Mark Twain's uncle. But I kind of had this notion in my head from the very beginning of knowing that Mark Twain, by his own admission, based a lot of the characters in his work on people that he knew. What if there was just some people he never talked about? Right? What if it was just like he essentially, for lack of a better term, stole their live stories and turned them into something else, right? And so I wanted to play around with that a lot just because I thought it would be funny, I thought it'd be funny to have a really angry, irate black man that's 102 years old who's mad that his life story has been taken from him. And so I leaned heavily into that. And then, there's a couple really solid books out there that are specifically about Missouri, what slavery was like in Missouri. There's a book that's all about, the world that Mark Twain grew up in. And then all you have to do is find two or three solid books. They don't even have to be that good. You go to the back to the bibliography and then you start looking to see what their resources were. Then you go to the public library, and these are the hacks for everybody who wants to do this. You start getting books from the public library. You don't buy them from Amazon. You get them first from the library. If they're really good and you think you might need them for longer, then you find an independent bookstore that has them and you buy them there. And that way you can mark up the books and write on the sides of the pages. And it's funny because I just had to do that with another book for another project that hasn't come out yet, but I had returned one of the reference books that I used to the library and I put it on hold and it was taking forever to fulfill. And I was like, all right, I'm just going to buy this book, and I found it was one of those more expensive books, but I found it used for me, what I consider a reasonable price. And for all you people out there who are wondering what's a reasonable price when you're a researcher, there's no such thing. It's like if the book's out of print and you need it, you just need to decide if you're going to buy groceries that week.
Well, what you do with Jim also allows you to take one character and kind of weave a lot of history into his one life story, but basically like letting us know a lot of stuff that we don't find in history books, but we're connecting with one character and being able to get like all these different things.
Yeah, no, that's it. It's like I didn't want it to be, Mr. Peabody and the Professor per se, where they're traveling, these characters travel back through time and, they're meeting folks from history. Although I will say that because I think Mr. Peabody and the Professor was part of the Jay Ward world of animation, which include like Bullwinkle and Commander McBragg, and because Commander McBragg did there's always these history stories. I watched a lot of that stuff. I hadn't even thought about that until just now. I watched a lot of Jay Ward animation as I was working on this particular project, just sort of thinking like, okay, let's look at how those animators and those storytellers sort of flipped things on their head. And some of that stuff is really hard to find. Like the Go-Go Gophers are really hard to find. And I mean, some of that stuff is definitely racist or problematic by today's standards. But if you can look past those things, you're going to see all sorts of inspiring things. I mean, you can't understand. I honestly believe this now. You can't truly understand Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn if you don't understand the history of the minstrel show, right? Because the minstrel show is what gave America what it thought was the black voice, the voice of blackness, the voice of the enslaved or the formerly enslaved. And once you understand the minstrel show, I've never talked to Percival Everett about this, but it's like clearly that's what he got from Huck Finn and the Adventures of Huck Finn in some capacity because it's reflective in his book as well. And I wanted to play with all of these ideas of how we perceive blackness. Um, because the idea of being black in this country is an artificial construct that came out of all of the ideologies that made slavery possible and allowed slavery to flourish. So you have to look at those ideologies. I have to look at those ideologies and think, how do I pull them apart? How do I break them apart? How do we begin to chip away at the myth of the noble Confederate and the carpetbagging Union abolitionists?
Well, one of the things you bring up too is you talk about Mark Twain himself, and you acknowledge that he was a writer who was trying to humanize a character like Jim, but that he falls short and fails in part because he's like as trapped by some of the tropes and stereotypes of his time, and that he may be a step forward, but he's also kind of restricted by just the world he knows personally.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so it's really easy to be hypercritical of anything that's happened in the past, but without context, that critical analysis, it's okay to be critical, but there should also be critical analysis within that criticism. Again, you have to look at Mark Twain, you have to look at his life, you have to look at all the other, not all the other works of fiction that were going on then, but what was the accepted norm, and then begin to pick it apart. It's not just enough to go, oh, I hated Huckleberry Finn and I thought Mark Twain was racist, which is what I've heard so many people say. It's not about hating him and it's not about thinking the book is racist. It's about, well, let's look at what those times were like and sort of understand where it came from. And I do think that character for its time was probably as progressive as you were ever going to get, right? The only way you would get a more progressive character would be if that book was written by a black writer and then published. And for all we know, that book was written and never got published, right? Like there's so much stuff that never sees the light of day. Even in this day and age, when it's so much easier to get work out there, there's still stuff that doesn't see the light of day. But I'm a big, huge fan of contextualizing as much as possible, and that's definitely reflective in the nonfiction work that I've done. When you look at the Black Panther Party book, I couldn't just start the book with the formation of the Black Panther Party, right? It was like we have to look at the years leading up to the formation of the party. Oh, wait a sec. It's not enough to look at the years. Okay, now we need to go back decades. Oh, wait a sec. Decades is enough. We need to go back to the beginning of, what I call the original sin of this nation. Even before it was a nation, slavery was an accepted practice within the British colonies and the American colonies. And if we don't understand that, it makes it more difficult to understand how you get something like the Black Panthers.
Well, in your introduction, you also introduced this idea that, Twain's book has been banned in some places because of problematic, offensive language, however you want to characterize it.
Mhm.
But that one of the things you wrote, he said that the depiction of racism and the dehumanization of slavery should never be made to seem less offensive because doing so dilutes the truth. So that sense of context and not forgetting like the past seems important to you.
It's very important to me. And I was complaining recently. There was a podcast that I was listening to. I won't name the podcast. You will be able to figure it out in a moment when I say what had me bothered about it. But the podcast was about Motown and Stax Records, and it was sort of a comparison contrast of the two. And it was like the people that hosted this show and whoever wrote the episodes really looking at it through a very contemporary lens. And they were looking at through this lens of like, well, Motown was owned by a black guy, Stax was owned by white folks, and therefore Motown was better, right? And it was like, yeah, that's what you would think if you didn't do the research, if you don't really study what's going on. And so to me, that's I don't know, maybe I'm old fashioned that way, but I feel like we should do deep dives into research. We should be looking at like, okay, well, how much money and royalties did Motown keep from artists like Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye versus what was Stax doing? These white folks that own this label in Memphis, Tennessee, in this recording studio in Memphis, Tennessee, and what was the music that came out of it? You do a compare and contrast, and you listen to the music, and you read the biographies, and you don't just read the Wikipedia pages, and you don't just read the contemporary history books, because a lot of times the contemporary history books, I say this as what I call myself, I'm an amateur historian, right? And a lot of times you'll find a factual error in one book, and then it starts turning up in other books over and over and over again. You realize, oh, everybody's just quoting this one book, or they're just using this one resource. And I have a book coming out about the history of the Black image in film. And I tell people the best book about Blacks in film was written in 1949 by a British writer. There's never been a better book, and I think it's called The Negro in American Film. Everything after that has been pretty much a watered down version of that book. And there's so many facts and interesting information in that book that didn't make it into more contemporary books. And so it's just you have to not be afraid to dive headfirst into research and to not, but just by saying that the best book about film is, blacks in film is, the Negro in film. There's people that would bristle at that. Don't bristle at it. Don't run away from the things that you might find problematic, because you never know what you're going to find in there.
Talking about history and facts and stuff, a lot of your other writing, you've written Shaft and Power Man and Iron Fist. You deal with superheroes, but no matter what you're writing about, I feel like you do bring a sense of, if not history, a sense of like reality or realism to whatever you're writing.
I try. I think a lot of that comes down to what I wasn't getting as a kid, right? And I was that kid who watched a lot of TV in the 70s. This was also a time when there was never more than 3 to 5 channels, depending on what part of the country you lived in. But I was always fascinated with Black characters, Black actors, how those characters were portrayed, who played them. There's a magazine that was published for years, Jet magazine, Jet and Ebony magazine, both of them by Johnson Publications. Jet was a weekly publication, and in the back of it, it would tell you what was going to be on TV next week and if there was Black actors in it. So it would be like, it was early 70s was always Flip Wilson is on this week, or Sanford and Son is on this week, but it would also tell you who the actors were that were in it. So I was that kid growing up who knew, like and to this day, I'll watch something, I'll be like, oh, that's so and so. And it's not just Black actors too. It's like, like, oh wow, that's Elijah Cook, and he was in Kubrick's The Killing, but he was also in Blackula. And people look at you like, how do you know this stuff? And it's like, it's interesting to me, and but again, that those Black characters that I saw as a kid growing up, whether it was like Marla Gibbs or the entire cast of the Jeffersons, Ted Land, who is an actor and was on shows like Love Boat and That's My Mama. I would become obsessed with them, the work that they were doing, and then wanting to know more about them. And I'll never forget that, going back to Ted Land, who was on Love Boat, he went on to become a director, and he made his own film version of Othello, where he directed it, and he starred as Othello. I happened to see a random picture of it in a book, and I was like, wait a minute, this guy Othello? What? Huh? Who? Where? And so you begin to understand that there's more going on behind the scenes, and it's like, how come I've never got to see this? To this day, I've never seen that version of Othello. I've also never seen the version that William Marshall, who starred as Blackula, was in. There's a filmed version of that. All that stuff is really hard to find, whereas the version with Laurence Olivier, those are pretty easy to find. So the blackface versions of Othello are really easy to find, as opposed to any of the versions that had black actors playing the part difficult. But it also says something about those actors, the William Marshalls, the Ted Langes. It says a lot about them. And I feel like I just want to do my part in sort of igniting or opening up the imagination and the curiosity of readers the way mine was opened up, again, with things like Jet Magazine, Ebony Magazine, Gary Null's book, Black Hollywood, which, there's 2 volumes of that. And, they were essentially picture books. And, it was either Citadel or St. Martin's Press that would put out these oversized coffee table books that were just nothing but pictures. And you could get one on monster movies, you get one on science fiction movies, but they had Gary Null did too on Black Hollywood. And it's like, wow, what is this? Who is Mantan Moreland? Oh, Hattie McDaniel. Yeah, she was in Gone with the Wind, but oh, she did all these other movies. And that's the sort of stuff that I don't ever want to lose any of that. And I want to make sure other people know about it, because it's very easy for that history to be lost, forgotten, or hidden for that matter.
Well, the character in your book who's an author, and other characters also mention this, that it's the idea that, you have to tell your own story. You have to make sure to tell it. We're currently in a time where the ideas of truth and fiction and myth and legend and fake news and alternate facts are all swirling around. So having this book out right now with those themes about who tells history and, what gets printed, the myth, the legend, the truth, how does that feel right now at this moment?
It feels scary, but it also feels good, right? I mean, I had this conversation long before the election. I've been having it even more since the election. It's like our work never ends, right? It didn't end during the 8 years of the Obama administration. It didn't end during the 4 years of the Biden administration. It still needs to, like our work never ends, right? There's always going to be attempts to rewrite history, to obscure history. Again, our work never ends. Rather than getting caught up in all the things that are going wrong, all the things that we don't have control over, all the things that stress us out, part of what I'm trying to do is focus on what can I do? What can I bring to the table, right? And sometimes it can seem silly to some people when you say, "Oh, yeah, I'm going to write a graphic novel about this, or I'm going to bring back a publication called Bad Ads Mofo," and it's like, but I know how to do this, right? This is, as Gordon Parks Sr., his one of his memoirs was called a Weapon of Choice. His weapon of choice was the camera and the pictures that he took. My weapon of choice are the words and the ideas that I craft and the things I build around them. And it's like, okay, so what are the weapons of choice moving forward in this ongoing culture war? And it's been going on for centuries at this point in this country. It's been going on since the colonists came over here, looked around and said, there's a lot of land here. All we have to do is steal it from the people that are here, thinking as if land can be owned, right? And then figure out, well, how can we work this land as easily as possible? Someone came up with the bright idea that it's easier to go all the way across the globe to Africa, steal a bunch of people, make them do a lot of the hard, heavy lifting, and you collect the money, right? And I'll talk about that. And I'll talk about that till I'm blue in the face, and if it offends people or it makes them hate me, the hatred of complete strangers does not faze me at all, right? What does move me though are especially younger people who are like, oh, I did not know this, right? And sometimes it's older folks too, right? It's because we're never too old to keep learning, right? We in theory stop learning the moment we die. But then who knows what there's to learn on the other side, right? So I choose to find my ways through the difficult times, through my creativity and this sort of passion for knowledge and sharing knowledge that was instilled in me as a kid.
Well, that idea of learning with Huck, you see that the racism is taught to him on a certain level by other white characters, but that he starts to make some choices on his own being close to Jim. So this sense of like that racism can be taught, but you can also kind of like unlearn it, or you can learn a completely different experience. And that seems to be one of the things that's central to the book is that friendship. Like that friendship seems at the core.
And yeah, and to me it was really, again, it was crucial. It was going back to the questions I asked when I was a kid. Why is Jim so loyal to Huck? What is the relationship between these two? And I come across as a pretty cynical person, but there's also this sort of optimistic side of me too, and that optimistic side that there's still hope and that people can change their ideas and their philosophies. Sometimes they change them for the negative, right? But all of this comes and goes in phases. All this comes and goes in waves. I mean, we just recently laid to rest, Jimmy Carter. And it's interesting to me because I'm old enough to remember when Jimmy Carter was essentially crucified by the media. He was called the worst president of the 20th century, all of this sort of stuff. And it's like, and now, oh, he's great. This is how the cycles work, right? And it's different every time, but it's also the same every time. And so there has to be somebody, and there has to be multiple somebodies who kind of stand around, sit around and wave their hands and go, yeah, I think you got this wrong, right? And I guess I'm one of those people, you know?
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I want to thank you very much for talking about Big Jim and the White Boy.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. And I hope more people read it. The best thing I hear from people is when they go, I read your book and I cried so hard. And I'm like, yes, that's the that's what I wanted.
That was David F. Walker, author of Big Jim and the White Boy. That wraps up another edition of KPBS listener-supported Cinema Junkie. If you enjoy the podcast, then please share it with a friend, because your recommendation is the best way to build an addicted audience. You can also help by leaving a review. And check out Cinema Junkie Presents Midday Movies video podcast on the KPBS YouTube channel. Till our next film fix, I'm Beth Accomando, your resident cinema junkie.